Hello and welcome. Today we delve into a story that exposes the brutal transformation of aerial combat during 1943, a moment when the skies over Germany revealed a staggering truth. Numbers and industry have the power to rewrite the laws of war. Imagine a single pilot, Heinzko, frozen at 25,000 feet, staring in disbelief at a colossal fleet of 376 bombers, mirroring a shimmering glacier of steel, flying in perfect formation, armed with thousands of machine guns. How could a mere 40 fighters hope to stand against such an overwhelming assembly? What secrets did German pilots like Kanoki witness as their once dominant air force faced an industrial juggernaut of the United States? Was this the moment when the very concept of aerial supremacy was irrevocably shattered? And how did strategic bombing, targeting vital production sites like the Messerschmitt factory and ball-bearing plants, accelerate the collapse of Germany's war effort? All these facts point to one haunting question: could human bravery and skill withstand the unstoppable tide of industrial power? In this video, we will trace the rapid evolution from German aerial dominance to near-total Allied mastery, uncovering how the Americans' relentless production and technological innovation turned the skies into a battlefield of mathematical inevitability. The heroism of aces like Galland and Steinhoff, once symbols of German pride, was no match for the cold, relentless logic of logistics and industry. From the devastating strikes of Black Thursday to the day Berlin was bombed in daylight, we will reveal how the once glorious Luftwaffe was pushed into a tragic twilight, its pilots fighting not just enemies in the sky, but the inexorable laws of modern warfare itself. Get ready, because what happens next is the story of how victory and defeat are decided not just by courage, but by the unyielding calculations of industry, technology, and sheer numerical superiority. An era where the sky is no longer the limit, but a chessboard of industrial mathematics. The journey begins now. On the 17th of August in the year 1943, at an altitude of 25,000 feet above the town of Schweinfurt in Germany, a dramatic and almost surreal scene unfolded in the cockpit of a German fighter plane. The oxygen mask of the pilot, a veteran named Heinzko, had frozen solid against his face due to the bitter cold and the intense conditions of high-altitude combat, leaving him to stare through his canopy at a sight that seemed almost beyond understanding or belief. The situation faced by German pilots like Heinzko was becoming increasingly desperate and seemingly impossible, as they found themselves outmatched in ways that challenged their very notions of aerial supremacy. In the skies above southern Germany, a mere 40 fighters had launched into the air from various bases, attempting to intercept an enormous and formidable formation of enemy aircraft, a veritable aerial armada of staggering proportions. As Heinzko looked out through the crystalline cold air at that great altitude, he saw a colossal fleet of flying machines, 376 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, dividing the sky between Schweinfurt and Regensburg. To the pilot's eyes, these metal giants appeared like a flowing, shimmering glacier of steel and glass, moving swiftly across the boundless blue, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the morning sun in blinding, dazzling sheets of light. Each of these bombers was heavily armed, bristling with 1,350 caliber machine guns mounted around their hulls and turrets, ready to unleash devastating firepower upon any enemy that dared to approach. These aircraft flew in tight, meticulously coordinated formations called combat boxes, designed with precision to maximize their mutual defense. These formations created interlocking fields of fire, walls of deadly lead that could be unleashed at any fighter daring to penetrate their defenses. It was a strategic setup so formidable that approaching fighters risked being torn apart before even reaching their targets. In this critical moment, units such as NOK's Jagdgeschwader 11, along with elements from Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 26, faced a mathematical reality that seemed almost mocking of human bravery and skill. The odds were overwhelmingly against them. Only 40 German fighters confronted hundreds of American aircraft. This stark disparity, 40 versus several hundred, was a situation that, only months earlier, would have been dismissed as pure propaganda or exaggeration by Allied sources. Yet by that summer of 1943, It was the grim, daily reality for the pilots of the Luftwaffe defending the German Reich. What Kanoki and his fellow pilots observed that morning was not merely a routine air raid, but a vivid, tangible demonstration of the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. An industrial supremacy that would, in the span of a year, threaten to drown the very existence of the Third Reich itself. The rapid transformation from a period of German aerial dominance, when the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies over Europe, into a phase of near-total Allied mastery happened with startling speed, especially between 1943 and 1944. Back in 1940, when German forces under the command of the Wehrmacht had swept across the continent in a swift and seemingly unstoppable wave, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed unquestioned supremacy in the air. By August of 1943, however, pilots like Kanoki were witnessing a reversal so profound that many would later describe it as witnessing their entire world turn upside down, as if the skies had shifted beneath their feet. The scale of the American bombing campaigns by mid-1943 had grown to an extent that German military planners had not even begun to imagine possible, let alone prepare for. The mission of August 17, 1943, officially designated as Mission 84, marked a significant evolution in the strategy of strategic bombing. Colonel Curtis Lame's 4th Bombardment Wing led an imposing force of 146 B-17 bombers against the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg, a key production site. Meanwhile, 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing targeted the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, knowing well that these components were critical to the German war effort. The strategic importance of these targets was undeniable. Ball bearings were recognized as a vital bottleneck in the German war production pipeline, and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg supplied nearly one-third of all German single-engine fighters. The underlying strategic doctrine was clear and uncompromising. The Allied forces aimed to cripple Germany's capacity to produce fighters by destroying their manufacturing facilities, and in doing so, also aimed to weaken overall war production, causing shortages of crucial materials like ball bearings that were essential for machinery and vehicles. German fighter commander Adolf Galland, a legendary figure of the Luftwaffe, had scrambled every available aircraft to meet this new threat. The various fighter units, such as JG-1 Usau, launched from Dan and Schiphol, JG-11 from Ye, and in an effort to counter the overwhelming American aerial assault, German pilots developed increasingly desperate and daring tactics aimed at piercing the formidable bomber formations. One of the most innovative and audacious methods was pioneered by a pilot named No himself, who experimented with dropping bombs from fighters directly onto the dense formations of enemy aircraft from above. On the 22nd of March in the year 1943, he achieved a historic milestone by successfully destroying a B-17 Flying Fortress using this unconventional approach. His success marked the first recorded instance in aviation history where an enemy aircraft was brought down by a bomb dropped from a fighter aircraft, an act of bold experimentation that he later detailed in his memoir, titled I Flew for the Führer. In this account, No himself described the attacks as highly experimental and perilous, born out of a relentless drive to discover new methods capable of shattering the defensive boxes, the tightly coordinated bomber formations that had become nearly impenetrable. Despite the ingenuity of such tactics, they proved to be mere pinpricks against the rapidly growing numerical and technological superiority of the American forces. By October the 14th of the year 1943, a date that would be remembered in German military history as Black Thursday, the situation had become even more daunting and desperate. On that day, a second massive raid was launched against Schweinfurt, with a total of 291 B-17 bombers crossing deep into German airspace. The Luftwaffe responded with what would be regarded as one of its final significant defensive efforts. Over 300 fighters were scrambled from 24 different airfields, a tremendous mobilization of resources. Among these fighters, Major Heinz Beer's 2nd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 1 took to the skies with their Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, armed with WGR-21 rockets designed for devastating strikes against formations. Meanwhile, JG-11 operated with similar armament, distinguished by their Yellow Reich defense bands, contrasting them with JG-1's red markings. The German pilots managed what appeared to be a tactical victory. They shot down approximately 60 American bombers, which translated to a loss rate of roughly 20.6%, forcing the Americans to temporarily suspend their deep penetration raids into German territory. However, this apparent success came at a catastrophic cost to the Luftwaffe. Between 35 and 38 fighters were lost in the engagement, including many of Germany's most experienced and irreplaceable veteran pilots. Among those killed was Headman Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, the younger brother of the legendary Adolf Galland. Headman Galland was shot down when his FW-190 was hit by defensive fire, a tragic loss that underscored the high stakes of these aerial battles. These men represented hundreds of hours of combat experience that Germany could never afford to lose, especially as the war progressed and losses mounted. Each B-17G model, Flying Fortress, was a marvel of defensive engineering, equipped with formidable armor and an array of machine guns positioned for maximum coverage. The tactical formation, known as the combat box, comprised between 18 and 21 aircraft flying in close mutual support, delivering devastating firepower against attacking fighters. This innovation, developed through bloody experience, rendered frontal attacks suicidal and beam attacks exceedingly dangerous. German fighters, notably the Messerschmitt B, F-109 G6, and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A4, were superb aircraft individually, boasting excellent speed, maneuverability, and armament. Yet reaching the American bombers had become an increasingly formidable challenge. The late 1940s saw the introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt, equipped with drop tanks that extended its escort range deep into German territory by late 1943. By the time the P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin itself in March of the year 1944, German fighters found themselves fighting a losing battle for survival even before reaching the bomber streams. Desperation drove the Germans to develop remarkable and often reckless innovations, among which was the Sturmgruppe concept. This involved specially armored FW-190 fighters designed to close rapidly to point-blank range before unleashing their 30mm cannons with devastating effect. When their ammunition was exhausted, these pilots were sometimes expected to ram the enemy bombers, a tactic requiring extraordinary courage and risking their own lives in the most extreme way. These Sturmgruppe attacks involved fighters flying directly through the dense formations of bombers, sometimes literally chopping through wings or tails with their propellers in a desperate bid to cause chaos and destruction. The story of Germany's most elite fighter units encapsulates this tragic evolution. The unit known as Jagdschwede's Ursa, named after Walter Osau, who was killed in action on May the 11th of the year 1944, exemplifies this decline. Osau, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 127 victories, was shot down by P-38 Lightnings, a stark symbol of the fate awaiting even Germany's most skilled pilots. Between the death of Major Hans Philipps, approximately 124,000 barrels of fuel daily in the early months of 1944, providing a staggering 92% of all aviation fuel used by the German war machine. These vital facilities, the backbone of Germany's wartime aviation capabilities, became primary targets for relentless Allied air assaults starting in May of that year. On the 12th of May, 1944, a massive wave of 935 bombers struck the synthetic oil plants in a devastating raid. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. The production of aviation fuel plummeted from an average of 175,000 tons in April to merely 52,000 tons in June, further dwindling to only 35,000 tons in July and dropping below 5,000 tons by September. The toll was so severe that by July, an estimated 98% of all Axis fuel production facilities were rendered inoperative, crippling the German war effort at a fundamental level. Ironically, despite these crippling losses, German aircraft manufacturing reached unprecedented heights, with a record output of nearly 40,000 aircraft in the year 1944, including over 24,000 fighters. Monthly fighter aircraft production peaked at just over 3,000 units in September of that year. However, the paradox was stark. These aircraft remained largely idle, grounded by the lack of fuel and trained pilots to operate them. The ground crews, desperate to conserve every drop of fuel, resorted to using oxen to move aircraft on airfields, an indication of the dire straits Germany found itself in. By November of 1944, all flight training was suspended altogether, and operational units functioned on less than 10% of their minimum required fuel supplies. Pilots were restricted to a single training flight per month, and by February of 1945, synthetic fuel production had fallen to a mere half of 1% of the levels seen in early 1944. The psychological toll on German fighter pilots was profound. Veterans who had entered the war confidently gradually became fatalistic survivors. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most successful aces with an impressive total of 176 victories, vividly described this tragic transformation in his memoirs. He reflected that in 1940 they were hunters, filled with the joy of pursuit and victory. By 1943 they had become the hunted, and by 1944 they considered themselves mere targets, aware that the war was essentially lost. The relentless Allied bombing campaign, especially the strategic oil raids, shattered German hopes of victory and eroded the fighting spirit of their pilots. In these grim circumstances, the German fighter units faced relentless attrition, with their experienced corps rapidly diminishing. The unit known as Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlagada, commanded by Oberleutnant Isef Pips Prill, maintained the Channel front through the pivotal days of D-Day. Despite achieving impressive individual kill ratios, this unit suffered catastrophic losses in personnel. Out of a total of 754 pilots who had flown with JG-26 during the entire war, a staggering 584 were either killed or wounded, resulting in a casualty rate of approximately 77%. By the end of the year 1943, of the 185 pilots assigned to the unit, only 107 remained operational and ready for combat. The unit Jagdgeschwader 11, formed in April of 1943, specialized in anti-bomber warfare, pioneering the use of BR-21 rockets, modified 21-centimeter mortar tubes firing time-fused projectiles into bomber formations from 1,000 meters. During intense combat periods, JG-11 claimed numerous significant bomber kills, but these tactical victories could not change the broader strategic reality. The Americans could replace their losses faster than Germany could. The continuous and devastating collapse of the Luftwaffe's training system proved more disastrous than combat losses alone. The pre-war German pilot training program was renowned for its rigor, requiring over 250 flight hours, including extensive aerobatics, formation flying, and gunnery practice. By 1944, this program had deteriorated to a mere 112 hours, often incomplete due to fuel shortages. In stark contrast, the American Air Force pilots received over 300 hours of flight training before deployment, arriving at their units fully prepared for combat. German pilots, by comparison, often arrived at the front barely able to fly their aircraft, let alone fight effectively. Johannes Steinhoff, a highly decorated fighter pilot with 176 victories, lamented this tragic decline in his memoirs. Reflecting on the state of training, he noted that they received young men, boys really, who had perhaps only 100 hours of total flying experience, including just 10 hours on the Bf-109 fighter. They were expected to be combat-ready within 2 weeks, but most of these pilots were dead within their first 5 missions. The statistics confirm the deadly cycle. During the first half of 1943, the Luftwaffe lost about 1,100 fighter pilots, which was roughly 60% of its strength at the early 2044. German synthetic fuel production had reached an astonishing daily output of approximately 124,000 barrels, which supplied nearly 92% of the aviation fuel necessary for the Luftwaffe's operations. These vital fuel-producing facilities had become prime targets for Allied strategic bombing campaigns starting in May of that year. On the 12th of May, 1944, a formidable force of 935 American bombers launched a devastating strike against the synthetic oil plants. The immediate consequences of this assault were nothing short of catastrophic for German war effort. The production of fuel plummeted from a high of 175,000 tons in April to just over 52,000 tons in June, further decreasing to 35,000 tons in July, and dwindling to a mere 5,000 tons by September. An authoritative report by Albert Schar in July revealed that an overwhelming 98% of all Axis fuel extraction and processing plants had been rendered inoperative, effectively crippling Germany's ability to sustain its military machine. This situation was tragically ironic and bitterly paradoxical. Despite the fuel shortages, German aircraft manufacturing capacity reached unprecedented heights. In 1944, Germany produced an astonishing 39,870 aircraft, including nearly 25,981 fighters. The peak monthly fighter output occurred in September of that year, reaching a figure of 3,311 aircraft. However, this impressive production was rendered almost meaningless in practical terms because these aircraft remained largely idle, stranded on airfields unable to take flight due to a critical lack of fuel. Moreover, the shortage of trained pilots to operate these planes compounded the crisis. In a desperate bid to conserve the scant fuel available, Luftwaffe ground crews resorted to using oxen to move aircraft on airfields, a stark illustration of the dire straits into which German aviation had fallen. By November of 1944, all flying training flights had been halted entirely. The combat units of the Luftwaffe operated on only about 10% of the minimum fuel necessary for effective operations. Pilots were restricted to just one training flight each month, reflecting the severe scarcity of resources. By February of 1945, the situation had deteriorated to such an extent that synthetic fuel production had collapsed to a mere half of 1% of the levels achieved in early 1944. This depletion of fuel had profound psychological effects on German fighter pilots, often surpassing the physical toll of combat itself. Those veterans who had entered the war with confidence and a sense of invincibility gradually transformed into fatalistic survivors, resigned to inevitable defeat. Johannes Steinhoff vividly captured this tragic transformation in his memoirs. He recalled, "In 1940, we were hunters. By 1943, we found ourselves the hunted. And by 1944, we had become nothing more than targets." He detailed how the realization gradually spread through the fighter units that the war was already lost, and that their leadership had abandoned every standard of responsible action in favor of survival. The culmination of this despair was the notorious fighter pilots' revolt on the 22nd of January, 1945. Germany's most decorated aces, Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Galuzzo, and Hannes Trutloff, confronted Hermann Göring at his residence in Berlin. This unprecedented mutiny by the top fighter pilots marked the complete breakdown of trust and discipline within the Luftwaffe's ranks. The pilots voiced concrete grievances, accused their leadership of cowardice despite impossible odds, condemned operational incompetence, and demanded the release of the advanced jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me-262, for frontline combat against the American bomber streams. Göring's response to this rebellion revealed his severe disconnection from reality. He accused the pilots of treason and threatened them with execution. When shown wreckage of P-51 Mustangs shot down over Germany, Göring dismissively claimed it was impossible that such aircraft could have entered German airspace, insisting they must have glided in from outside. Instead of executing the mutineers, they were instead celebrated as national heroes. Göring dispersed the rebellious pilots. Galland was dismissed from his position. Lutzow was exiled to Italy. Steinhoff was barred from entering Luftwaffe airfields, and Trutloff was removed from his post. The ongoing Allied bombing campaign, known as Operation Argument or Big Week, delivered the decisive blow to German air capabilities. Between the 20th and 25th of February, 1944, the Allied forces launched over 3,000 bomb sorties from the 8th Air Force, 500 from the 15th Air Force, and numerous Royal Air Force raids targeting key German military industrial sites and infrastructure. The relentless onslaught continued with catastrophic intensity as the Allied forces dropped an estimated 10,000 tons of bombs onto key German aircraft manufacturing facilities. This relentless aerial bombardment was part of a broader strategic campaign aimed at crippling the Luftwaffe's capacity to produce and repair aircraft, thereby diminishing their ability to contest the skies. On February the 20th, in what would become a hallmark of the air war's escalation, a formidable force of just over 1,000 American bombers, accompanied by a staggering 835 fighters, launched a massive assault on multiple German cities. The Luftwaffe's response to this overwhelming attack was fragmented and insufficient. Their defenses could muster only around 150 fighters at best, a mere shadow of what was needed to effectively oppose such a decisive strike. Captain Heiko Ka, who had recently been promoted to staff captain of the 5th Squadron of JG-11, documented the grim reality faced by German pilots on that day. His account vividly describes the chaos and despair. "We took off with only 8 aircraft. 2 of them had to abort due to engine problems before even reaching the combat zone. Of the remaining 6 that engaged the enemy, only 2 returned." He vividly recalled the skies filled with the iconic American P-51 Mustangs, a formidable force that dominated aerial combat at the time. By the end of that week, the Luftwaffe had suffered a staggering loss of approximately 262 fighters, and the death toll among seasoned pilots hovered around 100. Among those fallen was Major Hedman Kurt Uben, a highly decorated ace who had earned the prestigious Knight's Cross and boasted an impressive tally of 110 confirmed aerial victories. The American losses during this period, while significant, were swiftly replenished. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, yet they managed to replace these within a matter of days, underscoring the resilience and industrial capacity of the Allied war effort. This particular week, often referred to as the Big Week, served as a decisive turning point, conclusively demonstrating that American fighters had now gained uncontested mastery over German airspace. The once dominant Luftwaffe was no longer a match for the sheer weight of American air power. The date of March the 6th in the year 1944 marked a profound psychological turning point for the German pilots. On that day, an overwhelming force of 730 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators conducted a daylight bombing raid over Berlin, escorted by a formidable fleet of 800 fighters, including the legendary P-51 Mustangs. For the German pilots, witnessing American fighters so boldly patrolling over the Reich's capital shattered any remaining illusions of aerial invincibility. Despite mounting a total of 83 sorties against this colossal assault, the Luftwaffe's efforts were predictably ineffective, resulting in heavy losses with little to show for their resistance. German aircraft and pilots watched helplessly as their once glorious capital was engulfed in flames, unable to mount an effective defense or intervention. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most renowned fighter aces, later reflected on that day, writing, "March the 6th, 1944, was when I realized beyond any doubt that the war was lost. It wasn't because Berlin was bombed. Berlin had been bombed before. What made it different was that it was bombed in broad daylight, and the Americans suffered losses of barely 5%, while we lost nearly 30%. That day I understood that the tide had turned irreversibly." The memoirs of these legendary aces offer an intimate and poignant testimony to Germany's rapid descent from aerial dominance to utter defeat. They were the elite of the Luftwaffe, men who had once commanded the skies over France, Britain, and Russia, yet now found themselves overwhelmed by the relentless material superiority of their enemies. Adolf Galland, in his writings, emphasized the intrinsic qualities of the fighter pilots. Our element is to attack, to pursue, to hunt, and to destroy the enemy. Only by engaging in these aggressive actions can a pilot truly demonstrate his skills and valor. When you confine a pilot to a narrow task, take away his initiative, you strip him of his most valuable qualities, his aggressive spirit, his joy of action, and the passion that drives him to hunt and destroy. Johannes Steinhoff, who flew an astonishing 993 combat missions, lamented the decline of German air power, observing, "By the time these events unfolded, the leadership of the Reich had abandoned all standards of responsible conduct, both toward their own people and the enemy. The fighter pilots found themselves caught in the middle of this madness, fighting a losing battle with dwindling resources and diminishing hope." The evolution of German fighter pilot Heinz Knoke vividly illustrates this tragic decline. Early in the war, he had expressed a naive enthusiasm for combat, writing, "The prospect of actually experiencing war rather appeals to me." However, British and Soviet aircraft production, the disparity was staggering. A ratio of nearly 4-to-1 that Germany simply could not bridge, no matter how much courage its pilots possessed. By the year of 1944, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had become a shadow of its former self, operating in a state of near collapse. The once formidable force, which had dominated European skies in the early years of the war, was now reduced to a fraction of its strength, with only a small portion of its aircraft actually capable of flying at any given time. Despite the relentless efforts to produce more planes, the intertwined issues of fuel shortages, insufficient trained pilots, and the sheer scale of Allied bombing campaigns had rendered most of Germany's aircraft idle on the ground. A tragic irony considering the technological innovations that had been developed. The legendary Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of reaching speeds of approximately 540 miles per hour, an astonishing 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, had the potential to change the course of aerial combat, yet strategic errors and delays prevented it from fulfilling its promise in time. Germany produced around 1,430 of these sleek jet aircraft, but Hitler's persistent insistence on using them primarily as bombers, rather than fighters, significantly delayed their deployment until the very late stages of the war, specifically late 1944. When Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most renowned fighter aces, finally demonstrated the Me-262 to Hitler, he famously exclaimed, "It felt as though angels were pushing," acknowledging the technological marvel. However, Hitler's immediate concern was only about the bomb capacity of the jets. Strategic priorities were skewed, and operational use was hampered by fuel shortages and a lack of properly trained pilots. The few Me-262s that did take to the skies from units like Jagdgeschwader 7 rarely exceeded a number of 30 aircraft in the air at the same time, a stark reminder that even revolutionary technology was insufficient against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. On the iconic day of June the 6th, in the year of 1944, the entire structure of the Luftwaffe's defenses collapsed utterly. Despite years of meticulous preparations for the anticipated Allied invasion, D-Day, the Luftwaffe had only 100 fighters operationally ready to respond. Conversely, the Allies launched a staggering 11,590 sorties on that day, overwhelming German defenses. The Luftwaffe managed a mere 319 sorties in total, of which only 35 were by fighters. The legendary German fighter ace Isef Prahler's response to this catastrophe has become a symbol of futility. The entire JG-26 squadron had been relocated days prior, leaving only Priller and his wingman, Heinz Vodekik, at their base in Lille. When ordered to attack the invasion beaches, Priller later recounted with bitter irony, "Attack the invasion with just 2 fighters. It was utterly insane." They managed only a single strafing run over Sword Beach before fleeing, an act that epitomized the Luftwaffe's pathetic daylight response to what would come to be known as history's greatest amphibious assault. The toll on German fighter pilots was devastating. By the war's end, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 26,800 pilots, either killed or missing. The monthly loss rates by 1944 became utterly unsustainable. In the month of January, nearly 17% of operational pilots were lost. In February, over 18%. In March, more than 21%. April saw nearly 20% again. May, over 24%. And June, almost 26%. These figures meant that entire fighter units faced complete turnover every 4 months, a brutal cycle where new pilots, often freshly trained, would be thrown into combat only to be killed within a handful of missions. Entire classes of newly minted pilots, such as the December 1943 graduates from Jagdflieger-Schule, suffered casualties at an alarming rate, with as much as 80% of them killed within just 3 months of completing training. The attrition was relentless. Between January and June of 1944, units like JG-26, JG-2 Richthofen, and JG-11 endured catastrophic losses, losing dozens of experienced pilots, 58, 67, and 73 respectively, each one representing countless hours of combat experience that Germany could never replace. When Priller took command of JG-26 in January of 1943, he had 23 pilots with over 100 combat missions. By June of 1944, that number had dwindled to only 3, underscoring the catastrophic loss of seasoned veterans. German intelligence agencies grossly underestimated American aircraft production, a mistake that proved disastrous. In 1942, they estimated the United States would produce only 18,000 aircraft that year. The actual figure was nearly 47,836. The following year, their estimates of 30,000 were far below the actual output of 85,918. By the spring of the year 1945, the disparity in military production between Germany and the Allied forces had become starkly evident, with British and Soviet industrial output creating a 4-to-1 disadvantage that Germany simply could not surmount. This overwhelming imbalance resulted in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force existing only in name and in the minds of a dwindling few. Out of more than 1,000 fighters that were supposedly ready for combat, perhaps only 100 could be flown on any given day, and even then, the conditions were dire. Fuel shortages meant that each pilot was limited to roughly one mission per week, and the majority of pilots had accumulated less than 50 hours of flying experience, a fraction of what was needed for effective combat readiness. Heinz Koche, one of the seasoned German pilots, flew his final mission on March the 18th of the year 1945. His diary, a somber chronicle of the final days, vividly captured the grim reality faced by the Luftwaffe. Aircraft worn from constant use, pilots utterly exhausted both physically and mentally, fuel tanks drained, and the inevitable conclusion looming large: defeat was unavoidable. The cruel mathematics of attrition and resource depletion, which had been painfully apparent since 1943, had now reached their inescapable conclusion. Over the course of the war, the Luftwaffe had suffered the loss of approximately 76,875 aircraft, of which around 43,000 were lost in combat. The human toll was equally staggering. Approximately 165,000 aircrew members had been killed, 155,000 wounded, and nearly 200,000 either missing or captured. In stark contrast, the United States Army Air Forces, specifically the 8th Air Force, had lost about 26,000 airmen, an enormous number, but one that was considered sustainable given the vast manpower and industrial capacity behind the American war effort. Their losses, though grievous, could be replenished. German losses, however, were catastrophic and irreparable. To put the scale of the Allied advantage into perspective, in the year 1944 alone, the Allies produced over 1,199 aircraft, whereas Germany managed to produce just under 40,387. Such a chasm in production capacity was insurmountable. No matter how much courage, skill, or determination German pilots might have possessed, it could not bridge the vast gap created by industrial disparity. The fall of the Luftwaffe offers enduring lessons about the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Once considered the most advanced and best-trained air force in the world, German pilots had been systematically destroyed, not by a lack of bravery or skill, but by the inexorable force of mathematical and logistical realities. The American approach of mass production, combined with training that emphasized many losses as a necessary part of the process, proved far superior to Germany's reliance on individual excellence and tactical brilliance. While the German aces accumulated impressive scores that once evoked admiration, they could not alter the fundamental outcome dictated by production figures and resource availability. When German pilots faced the enormous formations of American bombers and fighters during 1943 and 1944, they confronted a stark, unprecedented truth. The skies had been transformed into an arena where industrial might dictated victory or defeat. Veterans vividly recalled the sight of skies filled with a seemingly endless tide of silver Allied bombers, stretching as far as the eye could see. An overwhelming metallic flood that signified not only military defeat, but symbolized the end of an era of German air supremacy. The swift and brutal transition from hunter to hunted occurred in a shockingly brief span of time. In 1940, only 4 years earlier, German fighters had dominated European skies, sweeping opposition aside with apparent ease. By 1944, however, they could barely defend their own airfields, and the decline was not a slow erosion, but a catastrophic collapse. This collapse was so profound that the fighter pilots' revolt of January the 22nd, 1945, became the final acknowledgement by those who had long refused to accept the inevitable. When Germany's most celebrated aces, men like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff, confronted Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, they voiced what every pilot understood but had been reluctant to admit. The war was lost, and continuing to fight was merely a path to pointless death. Their stark honesty marked a turning point, yet it was a bitter realization shared by all who had flown in the skies over Europe. The German pilots learned a brutal and unforgiving lesson about modern warfare. Individual skill and bravery, no matter how spectacular, cannot overcome the relentless march of systemic superiority. They flew their aircraft knowing full well that they were already defeated, that their sacrifices would change nothing in the grand strategic picture. Yet they continued to take to the skies, driven by duty, ingrained habit, or perhaps a sense of obligation they could not abandon, knowing that their efforts were ultimately futile. Their suffering and sacrifices serve as a profound, in the face of overwhelming material superiority, German pilots who confronted those massive bomber formations didn't merely experience the loss of a war. They bore witness to a profound and irreversible shift in the very nature of warfare, one that had been reduced to a stark industrial calculus, with outcomes already etched in the ledger of history. Their testimonies serve as invaluable records, standing as living evidence of this transformation. These brave men fought against what could be called the certainty of mathematics itself, and ultimately they were defeated, not due to a lack of skill, valor, or determination, but because they were up against an adversary that had turned war into a form of industrial mathematics, an unyielding, relentless calculation of production capacity, technological advancement, and sheer numerical dominance. From the blood-stained skies over Europe between the years of 1943 and 1945, German fighter pilots learned a brutal lesson. When the sky is filled with enough metal, be it bombers or fighters, the significance of individual heroism diminishes to insignificance. The legendary age of the fighter race, with its tales of heroism, skill, and personal glory, had come to its abrupt and tragic end. In its place, a new era had dawned, an era characterized by mass production, industrial efficiency, and the crushing weight of relentless numerical superiority. This was not a gradual decline, but a swift and catastrophic collapse, revealing that in modern warfare, victory is often dictated by the ruthless laws of industry and economy, not just by the prowess of individual warriors.